So we're going to look at problems with cultural relativism. To see these problems, you really need to keep in front of your mind the cultural relativist view or definition of what makes an act right. Always be thinking, when we're looking at these problems with cultural relativism, always be thinking, okay, according to the cultural relativist, an act is right when the majority of the culture approves of it. If you held to that, what would follow? What would you need to think about other things? And it turns out that a lot of the arguments for cultural relativism are what I call cannibalizing arguments. They're self-refuting. And the problem is that what motivates people to accept cultural relativism is often a reason for accepting universal moral truths, is often a reason for thinking there are moral absolutes. So many of the arguments people use to support cultural relativism are, unbeknownst to them, arguments for moral objectivism. So one of the main arguments for cultural relativism, it plays on this notion of tolerance. And cultural relativists would say that when it comes to morality, there isn't much that people agree on. But one thing people pretty much agree on, one thing that most people, at least in the Western world, think is a virtue is tolerance, that we ought to be tolerant of others. The argument goes something like this. Premise 1, tolerance is a great good. Premise 2, but only moral relativist views can agree that tolerance is a great good. Therefore, moral relativism is true. Okay, why think that only moral relativist views are consistent with a tolerant outlook? Well, here's the idea. If you're a cultural relativist, you think every culture is its own moral standard, its own ruler. It determines what's right or wrong, which means there isn't some objective, universal moral standard that can be applied to the culture to say, okay, you're getting these things right, but you're getting these things wrong. They are their own standard. So if each culture is its own moral standard, then it would seem like they should be tolerant of other cultures, because every culture is correct in its own moral beliefs and its own views. There isn't a moral absolute that they can get right or get wrong. They are always right because they're the standard of what is right or wrong. So you might think, okay, if the culture is the standard of what's right or wrong, then clearly we should be tolerant of other cultures. But that doesn't follow at all. Let's take a look at the argument again. The first premise, tolerance is a great good. What you'll find is that when people argue for cultural relativism, more often than not, at some point, they will appeal to a moral absolute of some kind, even though they may not recognize that what they're appealing to is a moral absolute. Remember, the cultural relativist denies that there are universal moral truths that apply to all people at all times. The cultural relativist denies there are any moral absolutes. But it looks like the first premise is claiming or making a claim about a universal moral truth, that everyone at all times ought to be tolerant of others. But if you're a cultural relativist, you can't appeal to universal moral truths. You don't believe in them. You believe they're fictions. And so it doesn't make sense to say, hey, it's this universal moral truth, this universal moral obligation people have to be tolerant of others. So that must mean cultural relativism is true. Because what you're really saying is there's this universal moral obligation to be tolerant, therefore there are no universal moral obligations. But if you say tolerance is a great good, you are saying that it is a universal moral truth that everyone ought to be tolerant, which is inconsistent with the cultural relativist view. Also notice that when it comes to tolerance, people, again, don't think about this issue very consistently or coherently, because they think we ought to be tolerant because when it comes to really important issues, everything is just a matter of opinion. There are no right or wrong answers. It's just whatever the culture feels is right. But when it comes to the viewpoint of intolerance, people say, but that view is wrong. But why? Why would it be that all these other viewpoints are equally acceptable and equally correct, even when they disagree with one another? But somehow, intolerance is the one viewpoint that is not just a matter of opinion. It's got to be wrong. You'll find that people who boast of tolerance aren't very tolerant of viewpoints that they disagree with, including the viewpoint that it's okay to be intolerant of others. Another thing to keep in mind is that if cultural relativism is true, remember, an act is right when the majority of the culture approves of it. So that means any act can be right as long as the majority of the culture approves of it, which means intolerance can be right as long as the majority of the culture approves of it. If cultural relativism is true and you live in a culture that approves of being intolerant of others, you actually have the moral obligation to be intolerant. So here again, cultural relativism is supposed to be supported by this idea that tolerance is a good thing. And yet the view itself allows for the possibility that intolerance is a great thing. It just depends on which culture you're a part of. The definition of tolerance. And this is something that your authors point out, that to talk about being tolerant of others from the cultural relativist point of view doesn't really make sense. Because according to the cultural relativists, it's not that some people are right and some people are wrong, or that some cultures are right and some cultures are wrong in their moral beliefs. They're just different. But the very notion of tolerating something is to think that someone or some point of view or some type of behavior is wrong, but nevertheless to permit it or to be respectful of it. You don't tolerate things that you agree with. You tolerate what you disagree with. But according to the cultural relativist view, there's nothing to disagree with because every culture is right in its moral point of view. So how would one culture tolerate another when the culture could never think we're doing some things right that this other culture is getting wrong? It's not tolerance because no one is ever wrong. So cultural relativism is often motivated by this idea that people ought to be tolerant. And yet we've seen a variety of ways in which cultural relativism doesn't even match up with the idea that people should be tolerant.